Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. Not going to say much here at the beginning except that, as I mentioned last week, the channel's at 5,000 subscribers, a little bit over 5,000 subscribers now. Thank you very much. If you haven't subscribed, please do. The level of quality you're going to experience on this episode is our standard level of quality. Oh, and I want to really thank everyone for their financial support, those who have been supporting the show financially. I have to buy a new computer to do the show, and it is looking like I'm going to be able to do it. So thank you so much for those who've been supporting the show. And next, some better lighting, and then we'll kind of be there on production values, hopefully. The best way to support the show is Subscribestar, and I'm dropping the link in the live chat. Where's the live chat? Here we go. Dropping the link in the live chat right now. Let's see. That's all. Okay. Let's bring on Ryan Turnipseed. Hello, sir.
Hello, how are you?
Very good. Hey, actually do a check real quick.
Check. One, two, three.
Okay, I'm going to back you off just a little. Okay, hopefully that's good. People in the chat can comment. All right, what else did I want to do? Yeah, as we turn to our topic, there is something to mention, and then I'll get into it. We're drawing... No, actually, let me do the intro and then I'll do that. Okay, so I'm going to jump right to something and then I'll tell you what it's from. Obviously, we're going to talk about a critique of democracy today. The author who we're drawing from actually thinks one form of democracy is okay, and he says it repeatedly. He says direct democracy is feasible in small units. It still survives in New England town meetings and in certain Swiss cantons. He says it is obvious that direct democracy restricted by size has a good chance to escape the character of mass democracy. And it's this mass democracy that we'll be criticizing throughout the show. But before we get started on that, he has a wonderful little thought experiment that I want you guys to think about. And we'll come back to this later. But first, just get this in your mind. He says, with the inventions of modern times, direct democracy could be realized in a large nation also. Not just in that small scale town setting. You could install black and white push buttons in every household. Remember, he's writing in 1952. So, black and white push buttons in every household, which could work by inserting a latch key. At noon, the citizenry could be informed over the radio by a steering committee in the Capitol about the various political and legislative propositions. In the evening, the vote could be taken and registered by electric adding machines, if we can imagine such things. Such technology in the center of the nation. At 10 p.m., the results could be announced. Thus, a nation could declare a war on Monday, suffer a defeat on Tuesday, sue for an armistice on Thursday, and reopen hostilities, if this were still possible, on a new motion on Saturday. Okay, so I'm just going to leave that there, and we will come back to this way later in the stream. But I thought it's a way to start thinking about our topic today. So what am I reading from? I'm reading from Liberty or Equality by Erik von Kuehnelt-Leddihn. And it's hard to say that name briefly. I usually say Kuehnelt-Leddihn for short.
Yep.
I had the pleasure of meeting this gentleman right near the end of his life. I think he died a couple years after I met him, something like that. He was quite elderly at the time. But he was an impressive presence nonetheless. And I really didn't understand at the time how fortunate I was to be meeting him. One other thing to mention is that our friend Skeptical Waves has an audiobook of this book that we're discussing. And we are not going to be finishing discussing this book this week. So great idea for you to catch up with it. I put the link in the show notes. It's a playlist with each chapter being a separate file, a separate video on YouTube. So that is one way to get into this material. And thanks to Skeptical Waves for supporting this show and a number of our other friends' shows by providing text-to-speech services with his amazing technology. Give it a listen. You'd be quite impressed. Yeah, and a listener mentions that the text is available for free on the Mises Institute. I actually didn't know that.
Yes. That's the one that I've been using.
Okay, yeah. So you're using a PDF, right?
Yeah, it's how I keep everything highlighted and keep my notes together.
Okay. Then. Okay, so where are we gonna go? Oh, yeah. So, what is he up to here? Well, I already mentioned it in my promotional material, but just one thing from the preface to the second English edition. He says, I call myself an extreme rightist arch-liberal. I'm not going to try to explicate that quite yet, but just to tease you that this is an interesting character, and I think a very relevant character for some of the discussions that have been happening on some of our friends' channels. And in fact, one of the big memories I have of meeting Kuehnelt-Leddihn was that I repeated the rather tepid defense of democracy that I had gotten from Mises. I probably said this is Mises's defense of democracy, and he shot me down in front of hundreds of good and great conservative, libertarian, important people. So, something I'm not likely to forget. He was a great critic of democracy and democracy in all his speeches, but I think this is the book where he particularly lays it out. Okay, so let me see here. All right, definitions. So one of the things he points out that I think is interesting is he makes a sharp distinction between, I guess you could say, democracy and liberty or democracy and liberalism. One place he says democracy has to do with who is going to rule. Liberty or liberalism has to do with the scope of freedom that an individual has under a given system. So one of the first things he does to try to crack the programming that we've gotten is to say that you could have a liberal or libertarian life under a non-democratic form of government.
Yes, and
right.
That's not so radical an idea in our circles, I think.
Right, but I don't want to assume anything. I want to bring people gently into. I'm thinking of Americans in particular. This can be pretty cognitive dissonance time, right?
Right.
Because the way that we have been taught is that you get phrases like liberal democracy. Sometimes they'll just say democratic freedom, freedom and democracy. These two things are just joined at the hip in American rhetoric. Am I being unfair, Ryan? That's kind of my sense.
Well, we're going to get there. That is undeniably the case.
Right. So. Yeah. So I think it's important right away with our definitions to understand that we're talking about two different things with democracy and freedom. Logically, they're certainly separate. Logically, you could, imagine that there's a democratic system that votes its way into tyranny for the individual, right? Tyranny for people. Or conversely, as Kuehnelt-Leddihn argues, you could have a, authoritarian style government, or a monarchy or some other kind of non-democratic form of government where the people find that they have a pretty wide latitude of freedom, maybe even more than the aforementioned tyrannical democracy, right? So the point is, these are two different things. They can logically vary in clearly. If we think about it, we realize they don't have to go together, logically speaking. But of course, Kuehnelt-Leddihns whole thrust of what we're going to discuss is that it's not just a logical case. He argues that democracy militates against freedom, in fact. It's a force pushing against freedom.
Right. So It's the difference. To get someone into this, you might make the case that democracy and liberty are both independent from each other, and then we're going to make the case that they are mutually exclusive from each other.
Right, that in
So,
practice they are actually enemies, and that's why the title of the show is Democracy versus Liberty. Okay,
right,
so a point he makes right away, he defines what he means by freedom. He says, in this study, freedom means the greatest amount of self-determination, which in a given situation is feasible, reasonable, possible. He says something else that I wanted to highlight because this has been a great confusion for people who haven't really studied the libertarian tradition of thought as I have. Many of my friends who have YouTube channels, in fact. And that is that people will say that someone who's an advocate of freedom or libertarian freedom or classical liberalism, using liberalism in the old sense of the meaning or the continental sense of the word, they see freedom as the highest end. Well, I'm going to give you an example here, Mr. Kuehnelt-Leddihn, namely, where he explicitly says this more than once, but it's right here at the beginning of the book. He says, as a means to safeguarding man's happiness and protecting his personality, freedom is an intermediary end and thus forms part of the common good. And he says this again and again, that freedom and politics, indeed, are intermediary ends. They're not ultimate ends, right? Kuehnelt-Leddihn is writing as a Christian. He's an ultra-Catholic, in fact, very, very, very Catholic. And so as a Christian, he cannot see freedom itself as an ultimate end. And it just so happens, because I happen to have spent 30 years studying classical liberal thought and libertarian thought, that I can't think of any serious thinker who thinks this way in the tradition. They all say things like this. Lord Acton says things like this. Liberty is the highest political end, he says. His point being it's not the highest end. He just thinks it's the key thing about politics, but politics itself is intermediate. It's not a final or ultimate goal. Go ahead, Ryan.
right. And you can even get this out of the where you would think you would find it, which would be, the economic or the political spheres. There were quite many theologians that pondered the question of freedom or liberty as well. And they also came to the conclusion, which might explain how we get the, what'd you call them, an ultra-Catholic or something, which is how we get what we have here today. Because the theologians, the theological side of it, mirrored the tradition. They were not necessarily involved with each other because these theologians were across the world, Scotland, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, the US. So not necessarily intertwined, but they mirrored the developments of the intellectual tradition, liberalism, that we're going to discuss, and finding that freedom or liberty was an intermediary and not the final goal.
Right.
So,
right.
So this is an idea that's just outside of this, not even necessarily unique to it.
Right, and exactly. This is just a part of what I would call the thought of Christendom. And I'll just keep repeating this. In my view, classical liberal or libertarian thought is one of the sort of the children of Christendom, along with many other things that you could think of. I would think of economics in the Austrian tradition as very much a child of Christendom. Certain aspects of our art, our architecture, our music are very much things that flowed from Christendom, are uniquely part of European Christianity, you could say. And so that's my view on liberalism and libertarianism, and it's best understood within that tradition. And absolutely people say, yeah, but some people take it and just try to do it without all the rest, and it becomes a perverse thing. I agree. Anything taken out of its right, any
out of its proper place.
Yeah, out of its proper place becomes distorted and inappropriate. And I don't champion that distorted and inappropriate view of freedom, right?
Right.
But my point is that's not just me. I keep reading the great old thinkers like Kuehnelt-Leddihn, Lord Acton, so on and so forth. None of them thought that way. So it's literally just a smear to some degree, which goes back to Karl Marx when he was smearing the classical liberals. So when it's repeated by right-wingers, it makes me sad. Okay, so, right, now remember, the episode, we're talking about democracy versus liberty because that's the first part of his book that we're going to focus on today. But remember that the title of the book is Liberty or Equality, or he could have said liberty versus equality. So not going to stress it too heavily here, but certainly there seems to be some kind of relationship between equality or egalitarianism and democracy. And that's one of the things we need to tease out as we go. But real quick, just as we're getting our definition started at the beginning, he is an anti-egalitarian. That is that was one of his biggest themes when he spoke, when I heard him speak, and that you find throughout his writing, is that he thinks that the trend towards having egalitarianism, equality as a great political value, is hugely dangerous, is not something we should compromise with. It's not one of the things to weigh against, well, there's, material prosperity and there's freedom and there's equality and we just have to balance all these things. No, that's not how Kuehnelt-Leddihn sees things. Equality is just not an ideal. It's a pernicious idea in political thought. Yeah, thoughts?
Right, and so this is a very great case that will come from just any basic form of Christianity, because that is how you get very Christian ideas like a vocation, that people are meant to do certain things and not others. So, I, as a man, cannot take up the vocation of being a mother. That's an inequality that exists, and you have egalitarians right now that are trying to destroy that. And that's just one example. You can apply that basic principle to everything, and that is the very Christian idea of inequality. That is that certain people will have their vocations, things that they are supposed to do, and it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be equal.
Right, and there's a moving passage in Paul, I think, Ryan, right? Paul's writings in the New Testament where he compares people. He says that we're in the body of Christ, and he compares people to like different parts of the body, and and he says, should the head, despise the foot or the toe, right? That's absurd, right? I mean, we each have our role to play, and someone who sort of looks down on someone else because they have a different role that they consider like lower, there's something wrong with that person. We are different, we are unequal, but that doesn't mean that some are, contemptible
worthless.
Or something because worthless or contemptible because their role is different.
Right.
And that's very much how Kuehnelt-Leddihn sees the world. I don't know how much you picked up on it, Ryan, but he doesn't seem to despise anyone.
Right.
But he doesn't despise the different classes of society and the different roles that people have. He writes fondly of all these different parts that people play, because he doesn't see anything wrong with people having different jobs and different talents, and right?
Exactly, and that's because you will. What you see is that this is very much about the natural development of a society, the organic development, something along those lines, a word like that. And these people will separate out into different classes, different professions, and different stratas of the society naturally. It means they're supposed to be there. It is what naturally happens. And if you take one out, it will now become unnatural, and you will reap the consequences of that. So if you get, say, a communist who completely tries to destroy the top of society and elevate the bottom, you're going to have consequences, not even on necessarily a material standpoint, but also just everywhere. Or if you have someone that tries to exterminate the middle or the low, you're going to have different consequences because they are supposed to be there in a proper organic place. Right.
So here we're going to be reading a lot from the book because Kuehnelt-Leddihn himself is not a bad writer. I think he has an ear for the good analogy or the good story, the nice detail, and he was someone who was able to function in like 8 languages, and was clearly a tremendous scholar. So he pulls in quotes from all over the place, and they're the best. There were quotes I'd been looking for years, and then I'm reading the book, and I'm like, that's where I found that quote. Of course, it's gonna in Kuehnelt-Leddihn. Anyway, so passage from Kuehnelt-Leddihn on this topic. Nature, that is the absence of human intervention, is anything but egalitarian. If we want to establish a complete plain, we have to blast the mountains away and fill the valleys. Equality thus presupposes the continuous intervention of force, which, as a principle, is opposed to freedom. Liberty and equality are in essence contradictory. Now, first thing that strikes you here, I don't like to spend a lot of time on the left versus right thing, but first thing you have to say here is this is not going to sound like music to the ears of leftists. If they value liberty at all, they're going to have liberty and equality somehow mushed together in their head as both highly valued things. Kuehnelt-Leddihn doesn't see things that way. He says, you want liberty, you have to give up on equality. If you want equality, you're going to have to blast the mountains and fill the valleys. And what does that mean? That means pushing a lot of people around, probably killing a lot of people, is what we saw in the 20th century. Right?
Yep. Right. And it also means just destroying the natural order as well. That's something that I really liked about this, is that this book is anything but a material analysis. It is comprehensive over everything, and it's worth its weight in gold. If you haven't read it, get the PDF and get Skeptical Wave's audiobook and start reading, because we can't cover the whole thing, and it's worth it. Every sentence is worth it.
Yeah. I've hinted at it, but let me just say a little more what it's like to read Kuehnelt-Leddihn. For me, it's like having one of these great multi-course meals where each course is so good that I get totally into what's happening with that course and I completely forget where I was in the meal. And they bring the next course and I'm like, what? There's more? What's going on? He is so rich, and so many little side comments that by themselves could send you off into reading multiple books, There's so many little rabbit holes he could send you down. He has a very rich, it's a very rich reading experience. It's quite different, and I'm not condemning Hoppe at all here. It's quite different than reading Hoppe, who also wrote Against Democracy. It's quite different than reading Hoppe, who tends to make a very step-by-step, deductive style argument. Kuehnelt-Leddihn doesn't really write like that. It's a little more like impressionistic, and he's just throwing all kinds of stuff out, but it's all so interesting. So yeah, it's going to pain us to skip over so many little side things and quotes and stuff, but we're going to give you some of them, that's for sure. Okay, he says a liberal, and this is the way we'll be using the term here. Liberal is very confusing because the term got stolen in the U.S. and England. I'm not sure. It got stolen by the Social Democrats, or the Democratic Socialists, one of the two. It got stolen by people like the capital P progressives in America, the Fabian Society in the UK. They started styling themselves as liberals, even though, of course, their principles were the opposite of liberals.
Right.
I tend to use liberal in the old-fashioned sense, or how it would still be used in a place like Spain, where you could say liberal and it would mean essentially what we think of as libertarian, but with that connotation of it being an older tradition. Whereas libertarian is a term we came up with basically because liberal had been stolen, and we needed to say liberal without using the word liberal when we're in like America, because people hear liberal and they think you're talking about Hillary Clinton or something, which is not at all what we're talking about.
To tie it into a theme that we're probably going to touch on just in a few minutes, the current definition of liberal is the kind of like the inheritor of the title of the Jacobin of the French Revolution. That's kind of what it. Yeah. So they kind of stole the term, their successors, and then libertarian was the one that was made from the people fleeing from that stealing. So.
Right, exactly.
We'll get to the
my intention is to steal it back. So it is the proper term for the Party of Liberty. So here's what he says, just to make sure we're defining our terms here. A liberal is a man or woman who is interested in having people enjoy the greatest reasonable amount of liberty And this, regardless of the juridical type of government they're living under. So he's saying you could
Right.
have a liberal monarchy. You could have a liberal junta. I don't know. You could have. Go ahead.
He makes a point later on, which I'm sure we'll also get to. You can have a liberal dictator as well in varying degrees. So taking the most anti-democratic form of government, you can have that as liberal as well. It's independent from the government.
Okay, let's see. Okay, now, democracy and democratic. These are political. The terms democracy and democratic are political. Democracy implies power or rule of the people, right? Demos is people, and then rule of is ocracy or whatever.
Right.
And let's see. Yeah, he says the reader is thus solemnly warned that we are dealing with a political concept only. So he says we don't want to talk about like the democratic way of life and other sort of like, where a word starts to just mean like good, like
Right.
where in foreign policy, the United States. Well, President Biden was just saying something like this. There's less democracies now than there were 10 years ago or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that means that there are well, that's jumping to foreign policy. But he's using it there not in a very precise way, probably, but more along the lines of democracy as good or aligned with
Right.
the U.S. or something like that, right? But
Yes,
we're not going to do that.
You
Go
can tell
ahead.
in the rhetoric he is substituting the term democracy for the word good. There is less good in the world now than there was 15 years ago, because none of the governments that we installed were democratic. That's just, if you analyze it from the classical definition, they didn't meet the criteria, and they never were going to meet the criteria. Democracy in the modern term just means good.
Right.
And that's a very unfortunate connotation. This is not what we
Yeah.
are talking about today.
Right. Okay, so interestingly, Kuehnelt-Leddihn, though an Austrian, taught in the United States for a while. I don't remember which years. He might have been in America when he wrote this book. I can't recall. But he actually talks about the Founding Fathers quite a bit in the 3 chapters, right? He talks about Jefferson, talks about Hamilton. He's a little nicer about Hamilton than we've been on this show. But,
Right.
people are complicated, so I'm willing to accept that maybe Hamilton was right about a few things. In particular, he says that Hamilton vehemently criticized democracy.
Right.
And then he also mentions that Jefferson is often called a Democrat, the founder of Jeffersonian democracy, as opposed to Jacksonian democracy. And he says that isn't quite right. Here's what he says about Jefferson. Jefferson actually was an agrarian romantic who dreamt of a republic governed by an elite of character and intellect and based on the support of a free yeomanry. So that is, he was not looking for a democracy, he was looking for a republic. Which I think even Americans know that there's some kind of difference between those two things.
Right. They don't necessarily know what that difference is if you talk to them, but they know that it's not the same. And you can see this as well with how the word changes. You can have Jefferson is looking for a very aristocratic republic. He doesn't want necessarily the most popular to rule. He wants the most competent to rule because they have risen up because they are competent.
Right,
it's
right.
a very aristocratic idea in nature.
Yes, he's very much, he actually uses the term the natural aristocracy.
Yes.
And by the way, Hoppe, I don't know that he uses that term. I think he talks about the natural elite or something like that. But Hoppe talks about the same thing, that there are people who, through being good at their job, which could be that, being a judge, say, which we view as a sort of a political position, right? Even in Hoppe's imagined anarcho-capitalist system, he says, some people would be better judges than other judges.
Right.
And they would rise up as people who are like, I want to have my case heard before this guy. He has a track record of being consistent, sticking to the law, making fair decisions, so on and so forth. Whereas this other guy, we all know that, whoever hands him the most money round back ends up getting the decision in their favor. So I don't want my case seen before that guy, right? So
Right.
someone who has a reputation for being honest, competent, etc., etc., can rise up even into sort of what we'd think of as sort of governing roles, right? To be a leader, a judge, someone who people look to organize, that sort of thing, right?
Right.
And that's what we mean. I think that's essentially what we mean by a natural aristocracy.
Right.
People
Yes.
who have a track record, in some cases, families. Now, that's a shocking idea for us Americans, right? But I have seen it. There are families who are capable of generation after generation producing a certain level of competence and character and so on and so forth. And other families that have a pattern of doing the exact opposite.
Right.
So you could even see how, though it's often had an artificial element, you could see there'd be a natural element in a family that the community looks to as, they tend to produce sons who make good judges or whatever it is, right? So anyway,
Right.
that's the notion of a natural aristocracy. Okay, yeah, there's that line I said. The democracy is concerned with the question of who should be vested with ruling authority, while liberalism deals with the freedom of the individual regardless of who carries on the government. A democracy can be highly illiberal. Oh, I love his first example, by the way, the Volstead Act. Most people don't know that it's called that. I actually have a whiskey called Volstead's Revenge, or anti-Vol.
Yeah.
It's picking on Volstead somehow. The Volstead Act, quite democratically voted for, interfered with the dinner menus of millions of citizens. And of course, he's referring to alcohol prohibition in the United States.
Prohibition. Yes.
Which was democratically put in place. And then he goes on to use many other much worse examples. Okay, so I think, did you want anything else from that first chapter to cover on definitions and so forth?
I was going to say, keep in mind that alcohol prohibition, because we'll get there when we start talking about uniformity, because that plays into a very anti-German policy that the government had at the time, and it'll connect. So keep prohibition in mind.
Okay, then let's move to chapter 2, Democracy and Totalitarianism, the Prophets. Okay, now, as I recall, at least the first section of this chapter, this is where his scholarship, he just goes hog wild, and he just starts throwing quote after quote after quote from all these great thinkers of the past to kind of beat you into submission, If you have thought that, well, sure, everybody knows that democracy is, the best form of government or something like that. He goes, he demonstrates very clearly that is not at all true. Hoppe makes this point as well. Historically, political philosophers have always been more than suspicious of democracy, which we're about to see. Okay, so, wow, there's a Feast of Riches. So let's see. Go ahead.
So, should we, I was actually, if I could, I was going to start with like the opening sentence or so.
Okay, go ahead.
Just because it kind of really outlines it. The notion that tyranny evolves naturally from democracy can be traced back to the earliest political theorists. There are allusions to it in Aristotle's Politics, but the description of this evolutionary process in Plato's Republic provides us with a picture which, without exaggeration, can be called an almost perfectly accurate facsimile of the insidious transition which took place in Central and Eastern Europe after 1917, and especially after 1930. So he connects this all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and he makes it very relevant for, at the time, what was something that just happened, a few decades ago.
Right.
Specifically that you can witness what the ancient Greeks were warning people about with the communist revolutions and conquests of the interwar period. It is the democracy taking over first in a country and then spreading its insidious ideals by force or otherwise to its neighbors. This is what the ancients warned about.
Right. In fact, I'll read a little bit more. So here in Plato, we find a description of the mass rebellion against the elites, the deification of youth. That's an interesting one. I'm thinking of the creation of the teenager, right, which happened about mid-century.
Right.
The ever-mounting expropriation of the well-to-do until they begin to defend themselves, whereupon the masses select a leader whose task it is to protect the people. We see the bodyguards paid by the demagogue, the flight of the wealthy and of the intellectuals, the rejection of democracy by the desperate upper classes as a result of this development, the evolution from protection to tyranny, the spoliation of the temples, the militarization of the masses, the recruiting of criminals into the police force, the provocation of military conflicts in order to impose emergency measures at home, and thus a stricter national discipline, finally, purges and a mounting wave of corruption. So he's saying, I don't know Plato's Republic, but he's saying it's all in there. And of course, as he describes this, I'm sure he's not just thinking of Plato's Republic, but he's thinking of his own country and surrounding countries that went through a process like this in the mid-century era.
Right. Yeah, and there's not just one, in case someone thinks that there's an illusion there. There are multiple happening simultaneously for different, what they thought were different reasons, followed this exact trajectory. So.
Okay, let's see. He says, he just gives a whole list of names on one page of various great thinkers who wrote against democracy. I won't go through all the names. Some of them are American, some of them continental, some of them British. This was an interesting note, though. He says it's important to note that about half the men mentioned could be called liberals, and there is no doubt that the liberals in this group were the most concrete and the most vocal in their denunciation of the impending evil, by which he means the evil of democracy unleashed. So that is really interesting, because I have even myself said sometimes that the classical liberals made a mistake in thinking that democracy was part of the liberal package. But he's saying the great liberal thinkers didn't make that mistake, except one he mentions here, which is John Stuart Mill, who's a figure who changes from being a classical liberal into essentially being a modern democratic socialist in his lifetime.
Right. But he, if I remember correctly, I think I have highlighted somewhere that he points out that even John Stuart Mill did not go so far as to embrace the full democratic theory that that will, later throughout will get presented with.
Right.
Before we move on from all of that, though, he made a very great historical point for people that were are keeping track of like timelines and histories. He points out that so we get a taste of democracy with the American and French revolutions, and for those two countries specifically, it was kind of natural, but not really. Because at the very least, you can make the argument that both of those countries had democracy on a small, very, very local level. The French Revolution, however, would devolve out of this already a bad thing going to something worse. It offered a spectacle of, quote, quickly following transitions, that is, society changing extremely rapidly from 1789 to 1815. And at the end of it, he makes the great point. Remember, we're talking about natural, organic societies. What happens when you introduce democracy to it? He says that the Ancien regime had suffered grievous defeats before it smashed the revolution. And from now, it could not, in a psychological sense, any longer be taken for granted. Joseph de Maistre, who is a very, very well-known reactionary around some of our circles, exhorted the supporters of royalism to defend the monarchic form of government with intellectual arguments, a sure sign that the patriarchal regimes henceforward were phenomena under discussion, and thus had ceased to belong to an organic order. So now, what people are naturally going towards, with kind of like the introduction of a very cancerous democracy in the form of the French Revolution, the natural order is now under question and going somewhere else, because the Ancien regime, the previous natural order, now has to be intellectually defended instead of just taken as like the starting point, the base, ground, it is the foundation. Now, with the introduction of democracy, it's being critiqued and it has to be defended intellectually, it's no longer natural. So this is the insidiousness of democracy.
Right, and a certain kind of rationalism, right?
Right.
There's a sort of rationalism that we've discussed, at least in our circles here, a certain kind of rationalism that thinks that by dissecting things, it can understand them.
Right. Exactly.
Almost like a materialist analysis or breakdown, and misses the point sometimes by that analytical approach.
Right. And so this is interesting to me personally because I've read and I've heard people talk about de Maistre. I have never heard the criticism leveled against him that he didn't go far enough because he was providing intellectual arguments to defend the previous order instead of just assuming that it was normal. And people that would defend de Maistre would probably say it was out of necessity, but this is quite an interesting critique of it, if you will. It's almost saying that he had accepted, parts of the democratic element.
Right. Okay, so now we get to the uniformism. It's a section called The Contagion of Uniformism, and it's just brilliant. Now, this is really interesting because it cuts against some of our friends, right-wing friends, because he talks about the identitarian instinct and the diversitarian sentiment. And Kuehnelt-Leddihn is on the diversitarian side, okay? Because what he sees is that democracy produces the mass man, right? It's got this egalitarian leveling effect, where differences, genuine differences, the kind of organic, natural differences that Kuehnelt-Leddihn sees in a free society, those are now viewed with great suspicion in the democratic society. We don't want that kind of thing. We want everybody to kind of think the same. And, before we get in the details, let me just, because I think it's going to trigger some of our audience here. Before we get in the details, let's just recognize what it's feeling like right now, right? It's feeling bad. It's feeling like you must not think differently than what you're supposed to think on a number of issues. Or, you're a really bad person and you should be shunned and probably punished and probably shouldn't have a job and, right? There's a stifling conformity that we're experiencing right now. So I was really connecting to this section where he's saying that the identitarian instinct or the push towards uniformity is insidious. So what does he say? Democracy, mass production, militarism, ethnic nationalism, racialism, and all tendencies toward simplification put the emphasis on identity and uniformity. Okay? And then he gets into some J.S. Mill, which I didn't want to really
I would continue because I think the rest of that paragraph, regardless of it being from Mill, like you can just ignore that and you can get the basic idea from it.
Okay, well, it is precisely from this process of leveling and assimilation that he expected some of the worst menaces to liberty.
Right. So that my statement earlier about Mill not taking fully a part of the democratic tradition, that's it right there. He rejected, even though he didn't reject the foundation, he still rejected the leveling and the egalitarian effects of democracy. So John Stuart Mill, who was like the bad person in a lot of liberal circles, even he didn't go as far as a lot of the modern propaganda surrounding democracy. And you can see that here. Even he recognized that egalitarianism, leveling, uniformity threatens it at a very core level, threatens liberty at a very core level.
Now we're going to get to a figure that I think is an exciting figure for me, Benjamin de Constant, or Benjamin Constant.
Yep.
He was in the 18th and 19th centuries, so bridging there. He wrote, "Variety is organization. Uniformity is mechanism. Variety is life. Uniformity is death. And then he talks about the aftermath of the French Revolution with Napoleon. He said, it is quite remarkable that uniformity never met with more favor than in a revolution raised in the name of the rights and the liberty of men. This systematic spirit at first went into an ecstasy of symmetry. The love of power soon discovered what immense advantage this symmetry gave it. Okay, so he's going to say this really well. Okay, no. Constant himself says it, so I'm going to put it in his words. Okay. He says, the interests and memories which are born from local habits contain a germ of resistance, which authority only reluctantly endures and hastens to uproot. It has an easier road with individuals. It rolls its enormous weight over them as easily as over sand. That's one of those quotes that I'd been looking for years. I'd read it somewhere and I'd forgotten. It's Constant talking about that image of the individuals as sand. What is he saying? He's saying that when you have sort of local community traditions and things like that, that can stand as a more effective resistance. When all you're left with, your social organizations and so forth have all been ground down by the state, then all you're left with is this massive state and the individual standing alone in opposition. And that's the image, right? You're just a grain of sand that the state rolls over. Then, he says, contemporary conquerors, peoples, or princes want their empires to present only a uniform surface on which the proud eye of power can range without meeting any unevenness which may offend it or restrict its view. So he's not making a big distinction here between cause and effect. Power likes uniformity. It's easier to control everybody if everybody's sort of the same.
Right.
But also, the move away from liberty and towards power produces this uniformity. So it's these things go together, right? Power and uniformity. Now, I think that and I'm sorry, last line from him. On all the rest, today's great... okay, let me finish that passage. The same code of law, the same system of weights and measures, the same regulations, and if one can arrive at it, eventually the same language. This is what one proclaims the perfection of any social organization. On all the rest, today's great word is uniformity, and he puts it in all caps. Okay, this can be a confusing section, this uniformity section, because our current overlords love to talk about diversity.
Yep.
Right? They come in the name of diversity, and here comes Kuehnelt-Leddihn saying the problem with them is they're bringing uniformity, not true diversity. So what's going on here? Well, I think everyone's noticed that, how do we put it? The diversity that the current regime brings is not diversity in every respect. For example,
it's superficial.
It's superficial. It's not a diversity of ideological diversity. We're supposed to all pretty much think the same in regards to democracy, equality, inclusion, diversity, all these things. Got to all be on the same page on that, right? But also, we could go further. They're not bringing a diversity of localism, the diversity you get from localism, right? Truly,
yes, exactly.
Yeah, local communities that really have their own traditions and really get to keep being themselves. Those things are getting ground down by globo homo, which stands for, by the way, global homogenization. Go ahead.
Right. So with this modern force, what you can see happen is they will preach diversity, which they themselves subverted the idea of, and they will bring in, people that would otherwise be completely different from each other. So it looks diverse on the outside, and then by the end of it, they are putting everyone in the same 2D corporate art style, where the only differences are superficial. What color should I draw this person with? What should I put on their shirt? So even then, half of that difference there is just the clothes that they wear. It's not even inherent to them. Back to the quote though. What that quote is describing, that rings most in my ears as a historian, is what happened in the history of France. Where if you go back to the late medieval ages, you have multiple dialects, even different languages spoken throughout what we now know as France. You have different peoples from different lineages, and you have the Bretons, which are more Celtic, and then you have more Latin, the more Latin-dominated South. You have different religions in different parts of it that perhaps spread there because of the different languages and customs of the people living there. You have different methods of different codes of law. You have different weights and measurements. And then as time goes on, as this democratic idea from the French Revolution spreads throughout France and eventually takes it over, it seeks to homogenize it into one artificially created French identity. So you get the metric system out of the Enlightenment, so it standardizes the weights and measures. The language of French is formally standardized, and they wipe out the Occitans, the Picards, and the Bretons. Still trying to do that in the case of the latter. They wipe out, any sort of different legal systems there with the the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So they wipe out everything, homogenize it as I think that we would recognize it to be a very evil or left-wing or whatever you want to call it force. It is very homogenizing. And they even spread it to other parts of Europe where, and we'll get to this in a second, I imagine, I would love to. They spread it to other parts of Europe, and the same thing happens in places like Germany, places like Italy, this same homogenizing left-wing or egalitarian or Enlightenment force.
Right, and he also says it's a democratic kind of force. We've got to all be sort of one voter, right? The citizen voter, right? So here we see Kuehnelt-Leddihn's diversity, or the diversitarian sentiment he calls it, versus the diverse, capital D diversity we get sold these days, right? And I think in a Kuehnelt-Leddihn world, I go to the South, and it feels different than if I'm in the West of the United States or if I'm in the Northeast. In Globo Homo, I fly somewhere and I'm like, wait, which city am I in right now? Because it all just looks the same.
Right, exactly.
It feels the same. Culturally, it's the same. Right? It all just sort of starts to blur and blend into a uniformity. Right?
Right, and if I can, so this started in France. It was the French Revolution, very French idea, quote unquote, the artificially constructed identity of French. It didn't die with it. So, you may know, later on in the 1800s, France lost to Germany. Their second empire was deposed. It was also the one that took a lot of Enlightenment values, tried to mix it with empire, didn't necessarily do that. They lost to the North German Confederation and the South German states, and they later unified almost immediately after the victory. Not Kuehnelt-Leddihn, it would be, he is quoting Konstantin Leontiev, I believe. He has a great quote about what happened to Germany as a result of their victory. He makes it out to be a very great loss. He says, "The victory of the national, racial, in parentheses, tribal, policy has thus brought to the Germans a loss of national personality. Germany, after her victories, has been more Gallicized than ever before, and her very being, her administration, her structures, her laws, important aspects of her personal local culture have suddenly faded away." So we can see here that this is not a force that is being, it doesn't have to go to you with a bayonet and force you to homogenize. It spreads just by its ideas just disseminate. And you get people who were at the time nationalists, very egalitarian, just on a racial basis, that tried to destroy the old order, erase local identity, and then their main movement drifted ever farther leftwards. The nationalists stayed. Now they are seen as right-wing, whereas once upon a time they were destroying the old order. So this isn't just a critique against leftism, but also what we might now see as right-wing in the form of nationalism, the artificially constructed identities that came out of this revolution.
Yes, yes. And it's been weird to find myself friends with people who call themselves nationalists, because I come from this older view, which, Ryan and I covered in talking about the war between the states and the rise of the American system. I come from this older view where nationalism is just what you described. It's not something I usually would have a positive feeling for. It has to do with
Right.
crushing the local in favor of this artificial nation that gets constructed synthetically by force.
Right.
Right.
And speaking of the U.S., you can see that where they destroyed state identity and local identity and replaced it with an artificially constructed post-Civil War national identity, and they called it patriotism so that you didn't have to worry about the scary word of nationalism. It's a very destructive idea, along with all of the other ideas that came out of this French Revolution.
Okay. Wow. I just realized how slow we are moving through what we were hoping to cover. We may just not get through it all. But let me jump through a couple things I wanted to make sure to share from this section. Okay. So let's see. Jacob Burckhardt, he cites quite a bit, a historian, I believe. He writes, "It seems that an essential condition for crises is to be found in the existence of a highly developed system of communications and the spreading of a homogeneous mentality over vast areas. But when the hour and the right material are at hand, the contagion spreads with the speed of electricity over hundreds of miles and affects the most diverse populations which hardly know each other. The message flies through the air, and they all suddenly agree on that one issue, if only on a sulky admission that there's got to be a change." I mention that because I'm still personally kind of struggling with this whole issue of how technology plays into political change. But for what it's worth, here's Burckhardt seeing that communication technology, he's seeing as playing a role in this uniformity of response to things, right?
Right.
Okay, now, he has to get in a mention of Marquis de Sade, and I had to share it just because...
Yes, I was going to if you didn't.
Yeah, it certainly seems relevant. I say he had to get in Marquis de Sade. Kuehnelt-Leddihn has a book called Leftism, and in one of the editions, at least, de Sade is mentioned in the title as one of his paragons of leftism.
Right.
And people only remember de Sade for sadism and sexual stuff. He actually was an influential political thinker on the French revolutionaries. The Marquis de Sade, one of the most original defenders of democratic dictatorship, combined his immoralism with the notion that the principle of equality should be extended to plants and animals, not only to man. Just dropping that in there. Now, want to jump to this Dostoevsky quote.
Yep.
This is from The Possessed, which is a book about left-wing revolutionaries. Yeah, I've read it. It's very good. I recommend it strongly. And he describes a leftist ideologist named Shigalyov. Shigalyov is a man of genius. He has discovered equality. He has it all so beautifully written down in his copybook. He believes in espionage. He wants the members of society to control each other and be in duty bound to denounce their neighbors. Everybody belongs to all, and all belongs to each single one. All are slaves and equals in slavery. As a final resort, there will be calumny and murder, but the most important thing remains equality. Okay, I'm not going to comment. That's just so obviously relevant to our time.
Right.
Let's see. And then one other thing.
Right.
Go ahead.
I was going to say right below that, just one sentence. There is a very pertinent remark. One law for the lion and the ox is oppressive. That is one uniform law for two different people, different in ability, different in makeup, different in, where they come from, is oppressive. And that is just a naturally true statement.
Right. Or you could say for different communities, right?
Right.
Okay, I'm going to jump forward a bit. He says, quoting de Tocqueville, which he cites quite a bit, equality is a slogan based on envy. It signifies in the heart of every Republican, nobody is going to occupy a place higher than I. Or as one saying puts it, the nail that sticks up shall be hammered down, right? Okay, the illiberalism of democracy. Right. So he thinks that democracy obviously is opposed to liberty.
Right.
Let's see.
So
And equality has to be enforced because it doesn't happen naturally. So it's something that you keep on having to. And I think we see this a little bit, Ryan, with the hiring quota, the quotas and stuff, diversity quotas and so forth.
right.
Jordan Peterson made an interesting point on this, just pointing out some data, which is that in the countries, I think in the Norse type countries, the Scandinavian countries, in the Scandinavian countries, they have gone the farthest in gender equality law and stuff like that. And he says, and they have the sharpest distinction between male and female in terms of the jobs.
Right.
That is where they've tried hardest to remove all obstacles. Men and women are specializing in different occupations more starkly.
Completely. Yep.
Yeah. So that is, because that's sort of the natural thing that would happen, women more in the caring profession, say, and more male programmers. That's just, anyone who's realistic knows that that's just going to be how things are going to be. Because that just naturally happens, the attempt to enforce equality means that you're going to have to keep doing more rules and pushing more people around, trying to get them to fit into your artificial idea of what equality would look like, right?
And with that stated, I think that an introduction to this topic would be the first sentence, if I may. An inevitable result of all leveling tendencies is an anti-liberal attitude. Already in earlier stages of our history, we encounter complaints about indifference toward liberty. So we'll jump into this in a second, I think, but we talked about earlier in the stream, you have to have an inequality to get, natural order. You have to have inequality to have liberalism. That is, you don't make inequality and then get liberalism. Just as a result of having liberalism as the state of things, inequality will emerge very starkly. Even in the Christian ideas, inequality is how you get vocations. That is the divinely ordained specialization of your life. So too is the contrary correct. In order to have democracy, in order to have egalitarianism, you have to dispense with liberalism. So they are contradictory. They're inherently mutually exclusive and opposite. So, are you do you have anywhere
Yes.
you'd like to go first, or should I
Let's see. I'm just trying to figure out how to make the points we need to make and move a little faster.
Sorry.
Okay, let's see. No, it's not your fault. This is just, there's so much we want to hit here. I'm going to skip that. Yeah, Lord Acton writing about the French Revolution in his lectures on the French Revolution. The deepest cause which made the French Revolution so disastrous to liberty was its theory of equality.
So
let's see, what else? Go ahead.
The last sentence of that actually goes against a lot of the theories that at least came out of AA sphere, if I may. Okay. It said, liberty was the watchword of the middle class, equality of the lower. So if you kept up, like maybe 2 years ago, it's been a while now, if you were around then, the big idea was that Puritanism and, the current elites were very middle class in their outlook, and they ended up destroying the traditional order of things. Well, here we actually see the middle class is actually concerned with liberty, which, as we've been discussing throughout the stream, is how you get that old traditional order. It's how different communities, different people emerge. The lower classes were the ones that were pushing for equality. The levelers, they were the ones that were out to destroy the old regime. So just might be a way to rethink maybe some conceptions along class lines.
Right. Okay, equality here. Who's he quoting here? William Lecky. Equality is the idol of democracy, but with the infinitely various capacities and energies of man, this can only be attained by a constant, systematic, stringent repression of their natural development. So again,
Yes.
going back to that theme that we are variable. Oh, by the way, I mean, I rarely pull rank on everybody with being a father of 8 children, but I will mention real quickly, one of the things that you learn as a parent is that the whole tabula rasa view of people is bunk.
Right.
I felt the differences between my children when they were born. When I first held them after they had just been born, I could see differences in their personality. Of course, I could feel differences in their body type right away. I knew which ones would be long and lean like me, which ones would be broad-shouldered like my father.
Right.
They came out of the womb different, and that is the experience I always hear from parents. They're like, I'm like an audience. I have a front row seat to watch the development of this person and their personality, but I'm not like molding them. I'm just assisting them become the person that God made them to be, basically, you know?
Right. And if I can tie this back to one of my previous points, to have everyone be uniform, as we discussed earlier, is it allows power to be exercised at even greater lengths. And then power itself will seek to make people standard. It will seek to standardize. So it's a positive feedback loop. And you can see this very clearly in history, where there is an undesirable population living in the middle of a country that is actively going against the will of the elites. Now, that sounds like I'm talking about something a bit spicy, but actually, in the United States, German was the second most spoken language up until about the 1920s. And there was a very strong German identity within the U.S., had been around for a while. The communities were built like German towns. Churches were built in German style. The graveyards, they were written in German. People spoke German. English is their second language. Where did that all go? Well, these Germans were against they differed very strongly from the elites in Washington. They were not in favor of World War I. They were not in favor of a lot of the progressive movement. So what did Washington do? Well, they banned a lot of methods in which you could speak German, namely over the phone, through telegram, things along those lines. They completely stamped out the language. They passed a number of very soft nudges in law to get them to start holding services in English, things along those lines. And they banned alcohol on the national level. If you know anything about the Germans, they have a very strong attachment to alcohol as part of their culture. Well, here we have the very homogenizing law in power bans alcohol across the board. So we've seen this in history. In order to get this egalitarian population, this uniform population, they will just force it on people because it is not natural. So
okay.
Thought I would tie that in.
Thank you. And I'm thinking of towns we were just visiting in Missouri that are German, but anyway.
Yeah,
where they have started to rebuild the beer and the winemaking that had been destroyed back 100 years ago.
Finally.
Anyway, right. So again to this Kuehnelt-Leddihn's emphasis on diversity versus a democratic mass man effect. Who's he quoting from here? Herman. Wait. Sorry, it's sometimes hard to figure out who he's quoting the way he does things. Mill. John Stuart Mill. A good quote, actually. He says, "What has made the European family of nations an improving instead of a stationary proportion of mankind? Their remarkable diversity of character and culture." Now, that jumped out to me because Ralph Raico, a good friend of Murray Rothbard, I got to hear Raico speak about the rise of Europe. the European miracle. How did Europe end up taking over the world basically for a while there? And he pointed just to this. He said there was never a second Roman Empire. There was never, that is, one centralizing force, force that sort of made everything uniform. Instead,
Right.
you had competition and diversity across Europe throughout the Christendom, basically, throughout the Middle Ages and into even into almost modern times, until really quite recently, historically, a couple hundred years ago, as you were describing with Germany and so forth. And the result of this was a flowering of culture and innovation and,
Art, music,
art. Yeah,
economic thought. Yeah.
yeah, remarkable diversity of character and culture, he says. And this was a progressive force in the best sense of that term, as opposed to the sense it gets pushed on these days. Okay, let's see. Oh, and then I shared this quote in Hawking the Stream, so I'm just going to read the whole thing because the ending makes it all worth it. J.J. Bachofen, I don't know how to say that right. Since the victory of Lucerne, the dogma of popular sovereignty and the omnipotence of democracy has become the practical basis of our public institutions. I don't doubt that this ideology is going to proceed to all, even its most extreme conclusions, if the conditions of Europe permit it, and if great catastrophes do not lead the people back to the true foundations of a sound political life. Yet, complete democracy is the end of everything good. Republics have the most to fear from it. I tremble at the thought of its expansion, not on account of property, a tax on property, right? But because democracy throws us back into barbarism. For this is the curse of democracy, that it carries its devastation into all domains of life, affects church, home, and family most severely, and distorts the true point of view on all questions, even the smallest ones. Because I love freedom, I hate democracy.
There's the title.
That's the tagline I used for the stream today. Okay, what else should we grab from the section? It kind of goes on.
If I may, just to illustrate just how total the divide between, even then, just how stratification will destroy, egalitarian sentiments. I thought I would share one of the spicier quotes about the Southern Confederation. So it says, quote, "The effective distinction between democracy and liberty, which has occupied much of the author's thoughts, cannot be too strongly drawn. Slavery has been so often associated with democracy that a very able writer pronounced it long ago essential to a democratic state, and the philosophers of the Southern Confederation have urged the theory with extreme favor, for slavery operates like a restricted franchise, attaches power to property, and hinders socialism, the infirmity that attends mature democracies." So, a very extreme way of basically just saying egalitarianism, democracy, will inevitably lead to socialism, and you're getting this before Hans Hermann Hoppe even formulated this idea. And this is even before this book was written. This predates the book itself. So, democracy itself is just a step to socialism, and in the South, for quite a while, the thing that prevented that was slavery, which is a very perhaps unsettling topic for some people, but it happened. It's a neutral statement.
Yeah, that slavery was how they were able to maintain a democracy in part.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So.
Right. So another thing to highlight real quick is that he talks about how there were despots in the past, of course, but I think he's talking about, quoting de Tocqueville here. He says their tyranny, the early despots, rested very heavily on a few, but did not extend to a great number. This is one of the things I noticed reading history. It seemed like, a bad king of England or whatever, if you were right around him, then, you might get your head chopped off, right?
Right.
But often the bad king would just kind of have these intrigues and stuff and leave the rest of the country kind of to its business. A good king, on the other hand, would try to make everybody's life better which often resulted in widespread disaster and famine. So, continuing with de Tocqueville, it seems to me that if despotism were to be established among the democratic nations of our days, it would have different characteristics. It would be more extensive and more mild. It would degrade men without tormenting them. And I think Kuehnelt-Leddihn only comments that he might have been wrong on the mild part. But but he's right on the point here is that the early despots didn't have that much of an effect on everyone. You know, if you weren't like a political player yourself, you weren't really in that game and kind of could go on with your life. Whereas now, the democratic tyranny tends to affect everyone, tends to have widespread effects, right?
Right.
Okay.
So
we have got such a big section, Ryan, and we just cannot cover it all. So flip through and like pick one more thing from section 3 here. I know.
Just for the people listening in my PDF version of the book, we're on page about 20. We're in the 20s of the page, so that's how far deep we're in with this amount of stream, and we've skipped half of it. So,
yeah.
If I may, I would like to go back to earlier.
Okay.
See, I don't think that we've talked about this. Did we give the William Lecky quote?
I did.
Or
okay, part of it.
All right. Okay. All right. That's it then. See, I don't think I have anything else highlighted. Oh, there is a Nietzsche quote.
Go ahead.
So, the democratic idea favors the nurturing of a human type prepared for slavery in the most subtle sense of the term. Every democracy is at one and the same time an involuntary establishment for the breeding of tyrants, taking the word in all of its connotations, including those of a spiritual nature. So here we get into something that is explicitly spiritual. That is, democracy it breeds tyrants on the one hand and prepares everyone else to just become a slave to them. And this isn't in the like the biblical sense of we're slaves to a good force. This is in the very, very bad sense of you are enslaved to a bad, petty tyrant. So Nietzsche quite correctly points out here, I think through looking back at the system itself, it will destroy the spirit of people, democracy. We've already covered, it takes away their unique traits, it takes away their culture, but it also takes away their very spirit. They have to defer their own will, their own power, their own decision making, their own person to a majority, and then eventually gets taken to a tyrant every time.
Right.
So I figured that was quite a very great quote there.
Okay, then right at the end of the section, he's quoting Lord Canning. He says, the philosophy of the French Revolution reduced the nation into individuals in order afterwards to congregate them into mobs. So again, back on that theme of like individuals as grains of sand, right?
Right.
You break down communities, families, religious groups, if you can, right? Break them down into just bare individuals, and they're more easily manipulated. And then Kuehnelt-Leddihn says crowds could more easily be dealt with than true personalities. And that's something we could do a whole rabbit hole on is I would say that Kuehnelt-Leddihn knows his Kierkegaard. And
yes,
he has that interest, which I do myself, in the person or personality, right?
Right.
People have debated in the scriptures when it says, let us make man after our own image. What does that mean to be made in God's image, right? And some people say that means we have reason and so on and so forth. I tended towards the view that above all it means we have personality.
Right. So
a rock does not have personality. A person does.
I've been waiting for just anyone that I know to do a stream on Kierkegaard, just because he is so integral to a lot of what we're talking about, be it state power, personality that's being destroyed, the destruction of the culture around us and the people around us. He covers all of it, and no one talks about him, which is quite sad to me.
Right. Oh,
So
he's a profound thinker. I love
yes.
Kierkegaard. I don't know how to get it into the topic of the show, but I'm sure we can do it. Okay, then the Prophets of Totalitarianism section. He's looking at those who saw that democracy would lead to tyranny, the end of liberty. Obviously, the point being that rather than thinking of democracy and liberty as being together, he brings many people to witness here that they could foresee that democracy would bring despotism. Let me see if I can find a good thing to share from here. Oh well, this is something that gets forgotten. Both Hitler and Mussolini insisted on the democratic character of their political systems.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's true.
Well, quite famously, they both thought they were personifying the people's true will. That is,
right. In the French
Hitler for
Revolutionary
the
style. Right.
Right. Yeah. And just because of their ideology, specifically the German or the Italian people, and then what that means they would later redefine. But it was a very plebeian system, a very democratic ideology that they were after, and that's why they took over in the way they did. Mussolini, with popular support, bypassing an actual election, and then the mid-century German, kind of winning an election and then dissolving the democratic process whenever he got the power through that process. So, and those are just two examples of the ancient warning that tyrants will come out of a democracy. And it happens elsewhere.
Right.
You don't need such extreme examples, but this applies nonetheless.
Okay, I'm really jumping forward to section 5 here of this chapter, Ryan. He talks about that we get an increase in centralization as a result in the growth of democracy. This alone is able to foster uniformity and egalitarianism and to ensure swift execution of governmental orders. So when you have a democratic or egalitarian ideal, you can't have all these regions that are doing things in different ways. Like how can we meet our diversity quotas if the regions are following different rules, you know? So he says centralization is a central aspect of the growing effect of a French Revolutionary style democracy.
Right, and it has to be, because a central theme throughout what we've talked about is that you homogenize more, it's easier to control, power seeks to homogenize so that it can control, it's a positive feedback loop. How does it do that? It does that through increasing centralization. And that's also why you see, coinciding with the French Revolution, not only do local cultures disappear, things get standardized, you get democratic ideology that spreads throughout Europe, but you also get the centralization and the evolution, if you will, and the eventual creation of the modern bureaucratic state. These things are all heavily intertwined. You can't have a homogenizing democratic state without the bureaucracy and the centralization. And centralization itself is just the exertion of power in a more concentrated form. So, of course, it's going to come about when there is more power being created through uniformity.
Right. One other thing, I had to mention this because it fits so much into what we've been experiencing in recent years. It says that the methodical suppression of all dissent and criticism by modern dictators is the result of their nervousness towards public opinion, a basically democratic attitude, as a contemporary analyst points out. Public opinion is manufactured and strictly supervised. So one of the things that Academic Agent likes to point out is that, the point doesn't come from him, I'm forgetting who brought it up, that opinion polls are presented as tools of gauging public opinion. But what we find is that opinion polls are often used to shape public opinion. That's this public opinion is manufactured and strictly supervised, right?
Yes.
And there's a million ways to do this. Anyone who knows anything about statistics, about how you can word questions on a survey, how you can change who you sample. There's so many ways to get like the answer that you want. and be able to say,
Or
yeah, no, I did ask people questions and they did answer, and these are the results. But
even better, the poll itself, regardless of what other sneaky things that you do, it's going to automatically bring you to the thing you want just because you've now limited the possible opinions to whatever you put onto the poll. Very,
right.
very rarely do you see these opinion polls in the modern day have like an open answer section. What do you think about this? Enter your answer here. It's pick from one of these that we've selected for the poll, and this is going to
Right.
be what we broadcast to the public. These are going to be the allowed opinions. It comes from the pollsters, and then they get that from elsewhere, usually coinciding with other powers. So if I just have my opinion poll and there are 5 options, those 5 options are now going to be the most popular opinions in the country, or whatever population it is that you're sampling from. So it's a great way to extinguish opposition among the average person, the populace, and it's a great way to push something which might not have been on their minds beforehand, just by including it as an option. So
Right.
even the existence of the polls themselves is manufacturing this.
Yeah, and I thought of something else I forgot. But anyway, yes, this whole shaping of public opinion, it's very important in a democratic system, right? Public opinion, supposedly. And so they, as he says, nervously try to manage it. Let's see, we're going to get out of this chapter and try to get through this. Let's see. He does not like racialism, as I mentioned. He says racialism, just like ethnicism, is a disease of the democratized masses rather than of the upper classes, or even the very genealogically minded nobilities. Hatred among nations, Volkerhass, is seemingly of bourgeois origin. So are democracy, sectarian liberalism, and all the other progressive ideas of the 19th century. Now, I think Ryan already helped us understand a little bit of where Kuehnelt-Leddihn coming from by talking about the diversity in France before it got French revolutionized, right?
Right.
This idea that we're going to take some big grouping, and now we're all going to consider ourselves part of that, some ethnicity or something, that crushes the smaller things within that. That's what Kuehnelt-Leddihn thinking about here, I think.
Right.
Right. And so some people, for example, have criticized those who talk about being pro-white by saying, well, already at that point, you've given in to some degree. Now, instead of being not just French and German and so forth, but Bretons and even more specific local traditions, now you're just white. Well, now you're like one white individual in this huge mass of Europeans, and you're losing a lot of identity at that point. You're trying to protect your European identity, but
so
you're losing these subsidiary identities, which were just such a source of strength in Europe, right?
I was on a cigar stream about a year ago where I was presenting my case against nationalism, kind of from a right wing or a Christian point of view, non-left wing. And one of the things that I had was you're erasing local identity by grouping us, at least in the U.S., together as white. And we can take this down to even its most extreme levels. Whites include everyone from, New Orleans up to Copenhagen. But after that distinction, don't have much else in common at all, even in heritage. Like they practice a different form of Christianity even. So it's a naturally homogenizing tool. And the fact that there are people on the supposed non-left that have taken it up as their hill to die on, their rallying cry, it might be necessary or practical or pragmatic, but it is not. It should definitely not be the end goal, because it's a naturally homogenizing, centralizing, uniformizing idea that we should stay away from if we want to keep our heritage, our traditions, the things that have been passed down from us from the locality. If I may, before we move on too fast, page 54, kind of nearing the end of chapter 2, He brings the sort of the Reformation, or the contrast from the Reformation. He quotes, he said, I'll just read the two very small paragraphs. The Protestant Alexander Vinet, or Vinet, I don't quite know where we're at, saw these possibilities of a further decline when he commented on the attack of the radicals against the monasteries in the Swiss canton of Argovia in 1840. Quote, they are going to abolish a lot of other things, if they are given a free hand. But naturally, they cannot do everything at once. They have now laid the axe to the monasteries and the Catholic Church, but they have not told us where they will stop. So, this is kind of a link, if you will, to the Radical Reformation. I remember that you guys covered that on this channel, especially with the Munster Anabaptists. Very, very egalitarian, very socialistic. Yeah. It's not unique to Protestantism, but we can see it here in some of the Protestant radicals that were tearing down the Catholic Church's monasteries, things of that nature. If you are a Protestant now, you know that they definitely did not stop there, and they eventually turned on the other Protestants and destroyed most of the denominations and eventually formed the liberal wing that we have today. It started with these attacks on the Roman Catholic Church. I thought that was quite a... He doesn't necessarily elaborate everything from there, but just he's including these things, he's including these ideas. And in just two small paragraphs, you get a lot of history behind it and a lot of strategy as well. Or a lot of what to avoid, perhaps.
Right. There's another theme I wanted to address. And that is he brings up some relationship between democracy and the conduct of war. As you all may know, war is a particular concern of mine, war and empire. So this is particularly of interest to me. He says here, the principle of the French Revolution, that all men have equal rights and hence equal duties, introduced conscription. That means being forced into being a soldier, right? And thus paved the way to our total wars. Folks, F-O-C-H, folks, wars of unrestrained conduct. Later on, he talks, it's right at the bottom of the page. There we go. Anatole France shared surely no reactionary flayed the merciless and pitiless cruelty of democratic warfare with its innate tendency toward unconditional surrender formulas and struggles to the bitter end. We've all grown up with the idea that the U.S., had to push for unconditional surrender with Japan. You may not realize that even then, in the 1940s in World War II, this was considered rather shocking. Like, why would you push for unconditional surrender? Why would you spill as much blood as you possibly can rather than negotiate, right?
Right.
Have a negotiation.
Especially when, the stated goal was to, stop them from threatening us. And by the time our elites were pushing for unconditional surrender, they had been pretty destroyed. They weren't going to threaten us anytime soon. So...
Right. So he says more on the war stuff, but I think that makes the main point, which is that democracy leads to these total war situations, which have just been horrifying in the 20th century. Compulsory education is a big democratic push, and he explains why. Okay, go ahead.
If I may, these 2 points, the one that you made earlier, this is something else that came out of the Enlightenment that I could be wrong on this because I haven't thought it through completely. Actually writing out a constitution which says these are your rights, I think that's a very, very bad French revolutionary idea. And the reason for that is because it does two things. It limits what your rights actually are down, and this is done through arguing semantics. That's a very obvious one people talk about all the time. I don't have rights because some piece of paper says I do. I have rights. The other one, though, is that now that we have this piece of paper that says you have the rights, and now that the vast majority of the population thinks that's where they come from, they're going to say, oh, well, you only have these rights because of these things that we're going to lay upon you as responsibilities and duties. And we're just going to keep adding to them. Conscription, we're going to add like a patriotic duty to pay taxes. because you have these rights, so you have this responsibility as well. So just egalitarianism, these rights comes with responsibility, conscription, taxation. Just so I was just thought that I could probably connect that idea a little bit. I didn't mean to cut you off on the public school system, but I just wanted to add very quickly, though, that's how France wiped out the local languages that was inside of its borders, was through mandatory public schooling. That's how it wiped out the Occitans. Yep, the Occitans, the Picards, the Bretons. That's how they wiped it out.
Here's what I got from Kuehnelt-Leddihn. I knew from the Yankee push for state schooling, public schooling in the United States. I knew that it had something to do with this push for democracy, but Kuehnelt-Leddihn really helped me see the logic here. It seems quite obvious once he pointed it out. If everybody's going to be participating in the political process, then everyone has to understand about, this is why we all have to learn the Constitution and so forth, right? We all have to be educated so that we're an educated voter.
Right.
Follow?
Yes.
So democracy means you've got to have education, and therefore we've got to make sure that education happens so that we have informed voting going on.
Yes,
right?
You have to be an informed citizen.
Exactly, and thus you get more education. And Kuehnelt-Leddihn points out, which I think we're seeing, that he foresees, or maybe it was already happening at this time, that there'd be a push for more and more people to get educated, more people to get college degrees, and so forth. And this would, at the same time, water the meaning of these things down, the quality of these things down, right? So he says more education usually means a lowered education. And, kind of already said this, but the very idea lying at the basis of compulsory education has naturally to be found in the notion that the children belong to the state or to society rather than to their parents. So when I have a baby, from the point of view of certain sick individuals around me, I have birthed a citizen and a voter that needs to be molded, right? And it reminds me of explaining to a German coworker, someone who lived in Germany, we were meeting up in London, that I homeschooled my children. He found this quite shocking.
Right.
But how is the state going to make sure that your child is molded into the proper citizen that it needs to be for the good of the society and the state? So this is democratic thinking, right?
That watering down of education, though, is something that I've seen personally, just in its quality. So we've talked about
some videos on it.
Well, yeah.
On your channel. His channel is in the show description. Everybody, make sure to subscribe. Go ahead.
Thank you. We've talked about liberalism will create inequality, and that's a good thing. It's how we get, organic society. It's how we get natural society, and it's how we get great things like cultures, languages, division of labor, all of that. It's also how we got a very good education system, because under the liberal system, that there is going to be inequality. It was understood by the educators that some people, this education is only meant for some people. So it's going to be a very high and strict quality, but they are going to be very learned, very good after they get out of this class. With the advent of egalitarianism and democracy, literally some government policies, quote, democratize, unquote, the school system. That was something that the Social Democrats did in the Weimar Republic. That inherently means that your education quality is going to decrease just so that they can get their egalitarian homogenized population. It's going to impact your education quality, and it's not going to do it very openly. It's going to be very subtle, so much to the point where, over the course of 3 generations, what was an 8th grader's test might now look like a senior level high school student's test. So it's a very disgusting and insidious thing that's happening, but it is happening. So don't forget about that.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen it, but it gets passed around on the internet. It's a 5th grade test from 1890 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And most college grads can't pass it.
Right, and I remember I was in one of my classes in my senior year of high school, like just last year, about this time. I found a literacy test from the state of Louisiana, and what it was is it was supposed to be at the 8th grade level, if I remember correctly, and it was to determine whether or not you could, have a license or vote or something like that. So bad reason, but it was still nonetheless like a benchmark of this is what the average speaking and reading level of a 12th grader, someone that had went through the public school system, had at the time. It was about the it was the very early 1900s. And I showed this to the people in my class. You had to get a 90% or higher in order to pass, to be considered literate. The majority of them could not pass it. And these were seniors in high school. So the 12th graders in high school now could not pass a basic literacy test from the state of Louisiana some decades ago. This is kind of just the decline. But they are equal in their inability to have this knowledge.
Yeah. Okay, I'm actually going to skip to chapter 3.
Sounds good.
I'll let you look around and see if that there's anything you just can't stand to skip. But I'm going to get started on chapter 3. Okay. Chapter 3 is called A Critique of Democracy, and that's where we'll end the show this week. There's more to this book, and we'll try to hint at what's to come after probably next week doing Econ Minis, where we try to touch into some current affairs. Things are going on in China that I really want to talk about next week, so I don't want to wait too long to talk about current events. Anyway, chapter 3, Critique of Democracy. Okay, so first, the basic problem. First of all, and this is Kuehnelt-Leddihn's view, but I think this might be one where Ryan and I are going to be on a similar page. He says, we are convinced that religion, or to be more precise, the character of a culture's religious basis, is the most important element in determining the affinities between nations and political forms. So this is an interesting thing about Kuehnelt-Leddihn that you don't necessarily see in someone like Hoppe, but you do see in his friend Guido Hülsmann, by the way, and that is looking at the religious background of a culture and how that plays into political forms. Rothbard, by the way, was pretty good on this, at least in the American context. He had a real sensitivity to theological ideas, even though he himself was not a Christian. He really thought, he says you don't have to be a Christian to understand theological ideas and to see how they play out in society and in politics and stuff like that. So Kuehnelt-Leddihn says, we are inclined to put the religious realities first and the geographic element in second place. This is in contrast, right, to gun, germs, and steel kind of approach, right, where the geographic aspect is really high. Kuehnelt-Leddihn puts it pretty high. Yeah, it's like the only thing. Geographically determinism. But Kuehnelt-Leddihn also puts it pretty high, but underneath religious realities. This is interesting and controversial in right-wing circles. Race, for instance, would figure a great deal lower in our tabulation. He doesn't leave it out altogether, controversially maybe these days, but he thinks it's not a heavy factor compared to things like geography and religion. Okay, so the vast majority of American and Englishmen talking about democracy always include the element of liberalism in their concept of it. So for analytical purposes, we've distinguished between democracy and liberalism, or freedom, right? But he recognizes the reality that in the Anglo-American tradition, these things have all been mushed up together, right? And then again, emphasizing his definitions here, democracy, let us repeat, is concerned with the question of who should be vested with ruling power, while liberalism deals with the freedom of the individual regardless of who carries on the government. So
exactly,
we can talk about liberalism under non-democratic governments, which is a shocking idea to Americans sometimes. Okay, so he says it's evident that the principle of majority rule is a decisive step in the direction of totalitarianism. And then he has a parenthetical I can't skip because this is something that's loomed larger and larger in my mind after reading this tradition all these decades. He says, of course, unanimity, which was an early medieval principle of government, is not oppressive. And that is where my own thinking has gone. Even in my life and how I function in my life, I'm interested in unanimity. Well, how can you have unanimity? You probably have to do things on a smaller scale, for one thing, because you're not going to get 300 million people to be unanimously agree on something. But you might get a couple friends together
Right.
and agree
So,
on a venture that you can do together, right? Why not
you
organize on a
and
principle of unanimity? Go ahead, Ryan.
you and I did a stream on the Wild West about a few
Yeah.
months ago now. And
Yes.
we did that because the Wild West was an unsettled land, and it was basically what an anarcho-capitalist society might look like. Um,
Right.
Came about naturally. People ruled by unanimity when they made their councils.
Yep.
It wasn't a majority vote that decided these things if they organized by democracy. It was unanimous decision making.
Right.
Otherwise, it would not happen. And we see this here again. So
And
it's the kind of
and
whenever there is,
and
yeah,
sometimes they would not have unanimity and they would just split up. You'd have
right,
two
yeah,
wagon trains instead of one, or two mining camps instead of one. They'd be like, okay, you guys go your way and you do things the way you want to do them. We'll do our way. So you'd get unanimity and secession. Those things really fit
exactly,
together, right? Because you end up
right,
realizing, okay, we're at too big of a scale to have unanimity anymore. We need to break it up into groups that can be in on the same page together.
right.
Yeah,
So we see that happening on the natural scale. No one forced them to do that. They came together and did it on their own. So it is what naturally happens when people say, all right, let's put it to a vote. Let's rule by unanimity. So
right.
I thought I would inject that there.
Yes, excellent. Um, okay, let's see. So what is the importance of freedom? Because my right-wing friends, I think, are so frustrated by the misuse of liberty and freedom to destroy community and so forth, right?
Yeah,
That
the traditional order, the natural order.
yeah, the natural order, that you can lose sight of the value of freedom. And part of the reason I wanted to get into Kuehnelt-Leddihn is he's someone who holds all this in tension. He clearly
Right.
values the natural order, tradition, religion, family, has huge high value on these things, but he also calls himself an arch liberal, meaning I'm more into freedom than you are, buddy. That's what he means by
Right.
calling himself an arch liberal, right? So what does he why does he value it? Here's one example. He says freedom is the average man's indispensable precondition for the development of his personality. And he quotes Goethe, the highest happiness of the children of earth is personality. So back to that emphasis on personality, right?
Right.
Now, there's a little side point here, which is that the saint or the ascetic is someone who, under unideal circumstances, even, accepting death, accepting poverty, is able to be free because they're so spiritually enlightened, right? This is like, the
Right.
Buddha or something, right? The Christian version of like
Right.
the Buddha. It doesn't matter my condition. I am just so enlightened that I'm just free no matter what you do to me. And he says that's great, but that's why he says the average. Freedom is the average man. He says for most of us, we need a sphere of freedom to develop our personality, right?
Yes.
Or you could say boundaries. I mean, I think about it with raising children. We have to protect them. We have to protect their childhood. We have to protect them from abuse so that they can develop their personality, right?
Yes,
If a
and
child is not protected, if a child does not have that sphere of, you could call it freedom, free development, if a child does not have that sphere and is, like horrible things happen, right, where young girls are prostituted out at very young ages, right, it tends to malform
Or
their development and distort their personality, right?
or in the modern sense, you can see that they're being forcefully homogenized into well, they were caught doing this, so therefore they're the different sex. So we're going to force them to change that now. That ends childhood right there and then. And you see that in the modern homogenizing state, the very democratic world that you are growing up in, or have lived in, or whatever it may be. It is actively seeking to destroy that personality. It is ending childhood as quickly as it can, and it is, on top of homogenizing, it is taking away the freedom or the ability or the liberty to actually differentiate yourself in personality.
Right. Okay, boy, this section on toleration of error is interesting, but I don't think we have time. Let's see.
If I could,
Tell
I had
me-
something
pick out
highlighted
what
in
you
red.
want to highlight. Yep.
Yeah, so I had just two lines out of the paper highlighted in red here, and I found this interesting because I remember a while ago now one of the critiques of liberalism or libertarianism, along with socialism, was that it viewed freedom as an end and that's why they were equivocable as being equally bad. Here we have right here, I'll quote it to you. Now, liberty is, as a matter of fact, an intermediary end, a condition or precondition rather than an ultimate goal. So, to this arch-liberal extreme rightist, and to most people of his tradition, liberty or freedom is not the end. It is just it's the bridge. It's the way to get somewhere.
Right.
So,
but it is a piece
we see
of the
this
story.
here. Right, yeah, it's not non-existent, but it's not the end either. It is very vital, much like a bridge to get somewhere, but it's not, you don't stop at the bridge. So, I just thought that I would throw that out there because it's very pertinent to some of our friends.
Yep. Now, egalitarianism. I don't think it's unfair that he's associating egalitarianism with democracy.
Right.
Right. It's democracy immediately introduces the idea that, hey, we're all citizens, we're all voters. You know, my vote's as good as yours. You know, all that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
And it can lead into and tends to lead into egalitarianism, which is equality is like an ideology, something that we're going to impose. So this is a great passage. He says, egalitarianism under the best circumstances becomes hypocrisy. You know, because it's not natural. It can't really.
Right.
It can't really be equal. Right.
You're just saying something that doesn't exist.
Yeah. But if sincerely accepted and believed in, its menace is greater. Then all actual inequalities appear without exception to be unjust, immoral, intolerable. I think we see this with the diversity push, right? What? We don't have, there's 5% redheads in the population and only 0.5% of CEOs are redheads? This is terrible. This is unjust. It's, we got to stop this anti-redheadism. And so, okay.
Right.
Hatred, unhappiness, tension, a general maladjustment is the result. The situation is even worse when brutal efforts are made to establish equality through a process of artificial leveling, social engineering. And those are some of my hot button words. I start getting a little red whenever anyone says social engineering. It makes me angry. So we're going to establish equality through a process of artificial leveling, or what he says is called social engineering, which can only be done by force, restrictions, or terror. And the outcome is a complete loss of liberty. And so he calls the French Revolution egalitarian and anti-personalistic, against personality and for making everyone the same. Right?
Right.
Okay.
You can probably tie that into everything that we discussed near the beginning. It does away with vocation, the division of labor. It does away with local tradition. Right. It destroys everything.
Right. Okay, then next section he talks about the moral aspects of democracy.
Yeah, and we're almost up to where we started the show with.
Yeah. Oh, let's do that. Finish with that thought experiment. Or not finish, but finish the thought experiment. Okay, so let's see. He says, this one is interesting. It's one of the things that's so great about history, about reading someone like Kuehnelt-Leddihn, who's very embedded in the great writers of the past and so forth, in history, is that they help us to see the things that are in front of us, but we're just so used to it, we don't see it. He says, modern government has achieved an autonomy from society which would baffle and frighten the medieval observer. Nietzsche's coldest of all monsters would terrify pre-Renaissance man. So this evolution of democracy, and he's going to get into that more near the end of this chapter, this progression of democracy results in a government that acts independently of society. It has its own ends, and I feel like we're seeing that recently, right? Many people are increasingly unhappy with what governments are, most governments are pushing for. And so you're like, okay, wait, we're democratic, but the demos seems unhappy with what, the will of the people as expressed through the state is, right? If we're really democratic, how can this be happening, right? But this is a progression that happens over and over.
Right.
Let's see. Okay, yeah. Let's do the thought experiment then. Right. So just to remind you real quick, he says, with modern technology, we could take direct democracy that works so well in Swiss cantons, right? Small
Mhm.
Swiss cantons and so forth can work at the level of a club or something.
New England townships, yeah.
New England town meetings. Yeah. He says, why don't we use technology and just do this at the national level? Boom. Right? Then we can have get rid of some of the defects of democracy, get rid of representation, which Gerard Casey destroyed in his great paper.
Right.
That we're not in any sense represented by our representatives at the scale that these representatives are supposed to represent, 500,000 people, or whatever.
Right.
And so he says, look, we can have a little button, black and white push buttons, and we can announce using our modern communication technology, hey, there's going to be a vote. We're all going to vote. That night, we're going to tabulate it. We're going to tell you the results. We're going to have a national town meeting, right? Kind of thing.
Right.
So, how do you think this would work? He says it is quite evident that this proposition is divorced from any practical value. But we have to ask ourselves whether a good, provided it really is a good, can become an evil if it exists in an unadulterated form. That means what he's saying here is this thought experiment would be like pure democracy, pure mass democracy, right?
Right.
But that's what we're generally talking about here, democracy on the large scale as opposed to the small scale. This would be the closest we could get to like pure democracy. We'd get rid of the representatives and we'd get rid of the payoffs, right, of somebody bribing our representative and taking them on a junket, right, to sway them to vote for a bill. You'd be coming right to us, the people, right? And we would decide. So this is pure democracy. And he says, obviously, it would be nuts. I mean, think about everybody voting on whether we should invade Syria tomorrow or something. And everybody just, there'd be a lot of propaganda, emotional appeals. You remember with the Iraq War that they were lying about, first Iraq War, they would be lying about babies. They were lying about babies in incubators being thrown out of incubators by the Iraqis.
Right.
So there would be war lies, and everybody would be like, "What?" Or World War I, right? The Germans are catching babies on their bayonets, right? That was the World War I.
Yeah, and
fake
they're
propaganda,
raping all the Belgian women, and
raping the Belgian women.
So,
yeah. So they would tell everybody that all these horrible things were happening, and everybody would push the white button for war, right? I mean, it'd be a mess. And so he says this is a way of realizing that the very mechanism of democracy, even if we could get it much closer to like pure democracy than we have now with a representative democracy, it would be possibly worse when we got it closer to pure democracy than what we have with the representative democracy, right?
Right. And he also has something mildly, well, at least mildly related to the point that you were getting at. He says, moral philosophy and moral theology, unlike chemistry, admit of no alloys. And then skipping ahead just a little bit, he says, valid ethics have to be at least theoretically practicable. So this strikes at quite a number of ethics that exist out there already, at least in my mind. And I hadn't really thought of, if you can't practice the ethic, then it is not valid. So, very simple thing that most people might not just think about. So it will tie in later as we go through this chapter.
Okay, difficulties and illusions. I'm trying to keep us moving forward. Let's see. He gets into some of the problems with different forms. He talks about this is not much an issue in the U.S., but we see this in other countries. There's the two-party method, which is essentially what we have in the United States, effectively.
Right.
But he says when you get multiple parties, you get into the situation where a small party holds the key to the absolute parliamentary majority, and that small party ends up effectively running the country, even though they represent a small portion of the voters, right? And people who are in multi-party, more than two-party systems, parliamentary type systems, know exactly what we're talking about. Very interesting comment about the United States. He says the United States has basically a one-party system. The election merely determines the strength of the wings. And this is something that people on both the far right and the far left have long said. There's not a dime's worth of difference between the Democrats and Republicans, right? You know that quote, Ryan? Who is it?
Yes, I do. And then there's also a very famous Huey Long quote, who was the socialistic populist from Louisiana that rivaled FDR. He had a very famous thing that he said. They were like medicine men, snake oil salesmen, and he had a name for it. And he was like, they'll try to sell you a medicine. One's made from the bark peeled from the top down of the tree, and the other one's peeled from the bark from the bottom up of the tree. Which one do you want?
Right.
So it's been a talking point forever. I just thought that one's always the one that I remember.
Let's see. Oh man, there's so many good things that aren't essential to our point here. They're just great. This is a great line. Revolutions and civil wars are merely the continuation of Democratic Party politics by other means.
Right. That's
a good one.
That's the war is just a continuation of politics by other means, but with
he's
a more
playing off of that
specific. Yeah. So he has written in here something that we might go back to, the totality of democracy just pervading every part of the social sphere. He writes, republicanism and democracy, with all their implications, are taught and extolled in schools and theaters, in daily papers and periodicals, in commencement speeches and in films, in novels, textbooks, and radio comments, in drugstore conventions, in sermons, and at cocktail parties. So this democratic force, democracy, egalitarianism, whatever you want to call it, leveling, it doesn't just stay in the political sphere. It goes everywhere. And if you can see it entering your life more and more as you go to different places, talk to different people, quite frankly, it's winning. The fact that people are talking about it more and more, and it's everywhere, it's inescapable, it's winning. It's taking hold. The plague is already here, and it's just spreading. So,
the politicization of like all of life is, Kuehnelt-Leddihn says, an aspect of democracy developing and developing into its final form. Politics starts to invade everywhere. The personal is the political, as somebody said, which is just one of the scariest things to hear.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think if there was something in the self-government section I wanted to highlight. Why don't you check that?
All right.
See here.
There's so much in this that I would like to talk about. He touches on the Weimar Republic and the...
Right. He talks about, again, on this person thing. He says, the voter in a parliamentary democracy is in his political capacity an individual and not a person. And he talks about being, here we go. In a modern mammoth state, the individual at national election is nothing more than a microbe. Whether he in particular goes to the polls or not makes hardly any difference. His person and personality, as Aristotle stated melancholically, is counted and not weighed. Thus, nobody is indispensable, is a highly democratic slogan. He contrasts this with his own view, which he calls the conservative and personalist view. He says the conservative and personalist would say everybody is unique, everybody is indispensable, nobody can be replaced. So again, this emphasis that democracy leads towards viewing people as mass, a part of a mass of undifferentiated, uniform individuals, rather than as, in the Christian view, right, which is Kuehnelt-Leddihn's, a person uniquely created by God with unique value and worth.
Right,
and their own properties,
This is a mathematical, a statistics concept even, called leverage, where if you're calculating a mean or something like that, you're taking parts of a population, an extreme value, if there is less people there, if you are taking less samples out, or less things out of the population, your n equals something low. An outlying value is going to have more leverage. Well, in a democracy, the more people you have, the less that every single vote matters, the less leverage it has, the less that some person here going out to vote can actually do anything. So democracy inherently turns into the statistical system. It's always going to be the more people in the democracy, the less that each vote matters, which is the complete opposite of what we were describing at the beginning of the show, what naturally happens.
Right. Had to throw this in for our friend Academic Agent. He says parliamentary democratic government is always strictly oligarchical in character. That means you're going to have a 80-20 type of situation or more, where a small number of people are going to have that real interest or talent or whatever, and really end up controlling things. And he says this has received a very thorough treatment by Pareto, Mosca, and Robert McKells. And he further says James Burnham, in his The Machiavellians, wrote a commentary on the oligarchic theory of democracy. So these are all figures that Academic Agent has been really focusing on. Okay, we're going to get there. Okay, ethics and representation. Let's see. Yeah, he talks about one of the characteristics of democracy is a lack of responsibility. And this is a point Hoppe really emphasizes. He's talking about both the voter and the people elected, but it's focusing on the people elected for a moment. The bar against the re-election or reappointment, because of like term limits and stuff like that, often puts them into a mood of frivolous indifference. So this is something Hoppe really emphasizes in his critique of democracy, that a monarchical ruler has a family and a long-term interest, whereas a democratic ruler, they have their term, or, well, in the case of our Senate, they have the rest of their life, but they can't pass it down to their children usually. So, so they're caretakers instead of being in the mode of being like owners. Go ahead.
There is a paragraph here that touches directly to that, and I think it makes the point very well. I'll be quick. As moreover, political power in a democracy is not inheritable except in a very oblique way, the judgment of history has hardly to be feared, as in the case of a dynasty. The follies of a Woodrow Wilson, a Clemenceau, a Lloyd George, or a Sannino had no direct ill effects on immediate members of their families. Most politicians are dead or in retirement when the results of their policies become manifest. But a Louis XVI, a Charles I of Austria, a Nicholas II had to pay for the errors or neglects of their ancestors. Still, the ethical problems of a democracy in action is greatest in the moral position of a politician. So that doesn't really need explanation. You can see what happened to each of those different monarchical figures based off of what they inherited, whereas the children of Woodrow Wilson or their fathers had no relation to their actual policies and how their term went.
Right.
So there was no incentive for them to create anything long-lasting at all.
Right. So short-term thinking, democracy incentivizes short-term over long-term thinking. Over that kind of thinking that where people are really building for the ages, thinking of generations to come. It's more, loot it while you can. Loot from the public while you can. I'm actually going to jump forward to the knowledge section. Again,
Sounds
you
good.
can just bring things back up if I'm skating over something essential. This is quite interesting. He talks about political decision and personal knowledge, right? So when you think about the small-scale democracy, small-scale direct democracy, then, especially with anonymity or something like that, unanimity, then you can see how you have people making a decision about something that they are directly involved with. They have the information, most of the information they need to make a decision, and they're going to experience the consequences of that decision. So you have knowledge and responsibility in alignment with the political decision, with the political authority, right? Obviously, in our mass democracies, that doesn't happen. So he says, back to this education theme real quick, this need to line these things up is somewhat subconsciously felt by the advocates of democracy, who therefore indulge in grandiose schemes of mass education. So Macaulay criticized U.S. democracy, I guess, and President Garfield of the U.S. said, "We confront the dangers of suffrage," meaning more and more people getting the vote, "by the blessings of universal education." So there it is.
Right.
We're going to give everybody the vote, and that means we got to force everybody, at first to get into some kind of government school. But as we've seen, it's expanded more and more to where now they want everybody to have a college degree, basically. And
Right.
in fact, he makes fun of that. I don't know that I marked the passage, but Kuehnelt-Leddihn makes fun of that and says something like, when everybody has a PhD, then, the whole system is going to be destroyed at that point,
Right.
with a system of education,
And you're seeing that happen in real time. That isn't some far away thing. It's much easier to get these credentials than it was 5 years ago, let alone multiple decades.
Oh, and so then he points out, then with democratic rule, because this universal education does not get you what you might hope for, you end up having bad results. He says a never-ending series of failures, and the reaction to that is the cry for the unlimited rule of experts. And that's where you get the deification of Fauci, for example. He's an expert on this. We will just do what he says, and he becomes like this big authority figure that's all out of proportion. Because first, it's this democratic decision, and then there's an attempt to educate everybody so we can make good decisions, but that doesn't work out so well. So now the masses turn to the expert, right? Sort of the new priest,
Right.
who brings with him not knowledge from God, but knowledge from science, right? Trust the science, right?
So, yeah, I did have one thing from the previous chapter that I think would tie into a lot of the it's kind of a lead into the knowledge part, because it's it's what happens with different candidates. And he has a thought experiment where he has, in theory, the ideal Christian, an ideally good pagan, and a bad pagan running for office. And the religious distinction is there so that their moral systems. And at the end of it, he summarizes it. You can go read it. It's in the PDF, page 113. It ends at page 114. He summarizes it very nicely in a paragraph, and this ties into a lot of the knowledge as well. He says, "This sketch could be continued ad nauseum. The ideal, I'm inserting that, the ideal Christian candidate would be sincere, frank, and serious. He would confess ignorance where need be. He would oppose his constituents when his conscience advocated disagreement. He would refuse to distort facts by popularizing them or by boiling them down to a deceptive simplicity, thus flattering the intellectual vanity of the credulous masses. The bad pagan simply lies to his voters. As Pascal puts it, one must have a mental reservation and judge everything by that, while nevertheless speaking like the people. He pretends to understand the problems he is not acquainted with, and simulates knowledge. He is determined not to stick to his promises or even act against his conscience." So, and then he goes on, "The good pagan is in the worst situation of all. He lies quite subconsciously to himself. He believes, perhaps in all sincerity, that one can square the circle, that one's own conscience, absolute truth, the feasible and permissible, the ethical and practical, public opinion and the useful, can all be brought under the same denominator. The tragedy of Christian existence is not for him. He would flee what Jean Wall calls decisions Kierkegaardians." I butchered that last word, sorry, but what we have here, that's summarizing a thought experiment. It kind of ties into knowledge. The only reason that this problem exists, this logical problem, is because not even the natural elite that are supposed to run this democratic government, the people that rise to the top, they are not going to know everything that they are supposed to know. They're not going to agree with everything, perhaps as a result of the knowledge issue. Nonetheless, the only way that you're going to be able to win in that system is to be the bad pagan. That's the only way that you're going to get popular support if the system decides by popular support. And if it is just like a shadow elite that picks it, you're not going to convince them by being the good Christian. You're going to convince them to pick you to be the representative if you tell them what they want to hear, which is, throughout the thought experiment, what the theoretical bad pagan is supposed to do. He tells people what they want to hear. He's the yes man. This is what this system, either direct or indirect, if you have the people actually voting and they actually decide, or if you have a shadow elite that do it, it's not going to be the good Christian or the good pagan that gets in. It's going to be the bad pagan, the person with no moral principles, with no underlying ethic, that will just lie to get power. It's going to be him that dominates the system.
Right.
I figure I would add that before we moved on too far.
Right. So now I'm going to jump to, this is pretty much wrapping it up, I think, Shadows of Tyranny. And this is where he's getting into how democracy turns into tyranny, which for some reason we've been so brainwashed in the United States that we don't realize that democracies have turned into tyrannies. But his point is that they certainly have, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But he says there's various ways for this to happen. One is, he says, we have likened the parliaments with these elections, with their elections, to race courses in which finally, after many indecisive rounds, a real winner will appear. But the achievement of a real majority by one single party usually signals the very end of the constitutional process. In all likelihood, a determined effort will be made to freeze this happy situation and to cancel the struggle for supremacy once and for all by constitutional amendments. So the Democratic Party, it seems to me, in the United States has very much been trying to accomplish this.
Yes.
In part by having immigration of a sort that will increase its voters.
Right.
To expand the amount of people who will vote for Democrats. Which doesn't exactly work the way they want because people are more complicated, but that's part of the strategy. But I think now with the recent fortified election, and various voting rules that are being put in place, there's a real attempt to make it so that basically the Democratic Party is just the only party that ever is in the presidency, for instance. Forever.
Right, and
I don't know that they'll succeed. I don't know that they'll succeed, but if they do, we would be in that process, that next stage that he's talking about, where they now just sort of freeze themselves into place.
And it's not going to be formal, and they are most likely going to keep the GOP around so as not to alarm anyone that it's now a one-party state, even though it is.
Right.
And
exactly.
Just drawing upon the history of South Africa, when they do this, when they know that their voting bloc is the majority in the country because they've imported them, they're going to then stop focusing on the political sphere and start focusing on capital, the economy. They're going to start focusing on livelihoods. They're already gearing up to do this. You can see that with recent mass actions coming from the federal government mandating people to do certain things. Mm-hmm. They're already focusing on personal life, personal economic interaction by restricting it with people that they don't like. And they're focusing on the people that used to rule the country as well.
Right.
They're going to really gear up and focus on those things after they have completely won the political sphere and it's under lock and key. Mm-hmm. And they haven't quite made it there yet, but they are gearing up to it, and you can see that.
Right. I mean, I hope they fail, but we can see the directionality.
Right.
And the strong impetus towards just essentially ending what we think of as whatever kind of democratic system we have. It would just be a one-party state. So this is not unprecedented. He says it must be borne in mind that all modern tyrannies were and are party dictatorships with a parliamentary prehistory. You have you have a party, this happened in mid-century Germany, you have a party that sort of wins through the parliamentary process, and then they just like freeze it at that point
Right.
and say we're going to just be the party because it's an emergency, and that sort of thing, right?
Again, these are our seats. This is our chamber. Yeah.
Right. And
So,
Plato warned of this. He said, tyranny then arises from no other form of government than democracy. So people think it's funny in America that, the Soviet Union, for example, had the Soviets and the Congress of Soviets.
right.
But that's because, from their point of view, they were continuing the forms. It's just that now there was just basically one party that
Right,
was
exactly.
effectively in power, right?
The communist defenders in the last century would say, well, there is a democracy in the Soviet Union. They're very democratic, much more than we are. It's only that you can only be of one party in order to run. But you get to vote for them or not vote for them, and that's your democratic voice in this democratic country. Obviously,
Right.
even the supporters of a very strong democracy laughed at this because that little caveat that they sneak in at the end, you have to be a part of this party in order to run.
Right.
It's obviously not what they're after, and it's a dictatorial state. And I think that you were going on to make this point before I interrupted you. We
No,
kind of have
go
that
ahead.
here.
You finished the point, because I'm looking
sorry.
to wrap this up here.
All right.
Go ahead.
We are at that stage right now. You have to be in the GOP or the Democratic Party, the Omniparty. They're the same thing, basically, just in different areas. You have to be in one of those two in order to make it to the government here. Or you join one of them and then leave, and then you get kicked out at the next election. So, and there have been maybe 3 examples of people in modern U.S. history that weren't part of the major 2 parties that stayed in government, even though they started in the major 2. It's not the majority. It's not the trend. They were outliers. We have the exact same Soviet system, except unlike the Soviet system, where if not enough people voted in favor of the candidate, they got kicked out of the party and usually reprimanded quite extensively and sent to Siberia. If not enough people vote in our elections, we just don't care. They just win the election even easier. So this, quite ironically, I think that the Soviets had it ever so slightly better in terms of political organization, because at least people not voting got bad politicians sent to Siberia. I wish that we could simulate that here.
Right. Okay, well, this is the final thing I think I'm going to quote, because we just have got to stop somewhere. He ends here this final bit on the critique of democracy. He says, the dangers besetting democracies and forcing them down the path to tyranny are so numerous that we have to be critical of this form of government, not only on account of its intrinsic weaknesses, but also for its evolutionary potentialities. So in the arguments hopefully we've shared, democracy has problems in and of itself. It's push towards uniformity, coercive state education. These are all part and parcel. The egalitarian aspect of it, the leveling egalitarian aspect of it. These are all just something you get when you have democracy. But he says there's all that, and there's the tendency of democracy to go into just an outright tyranny, to become a one-party state, and then you're just outright at dictatorship and oppression, and if you're not with us, then we send you to the camps, kind of a situation, right? And it does feel like we're closer to that than I ever dreamed we would have been at this point in history, I have to say. With the treatment
even just 2 years ago.
With the treatment of some protesters, some recent protesters, my understanding is they're effectively outright being tortured. I would not have expected something like this soon.
Yeah. And that's just the flashy stuff. Just how open they're being with their flagrant exercise of tyrannical power. It would have been unthinkable even 2 years ago. You would have thought, well, there's no way they would do this because that would actually push people over the edge. They're doing it incrementally. No, they're just going all in now. So
they're going for it. Yeah.
yeah.
So I think the relevance of what he calls the evolutionary potentialities of democracy, the way it goes towards a one-party state eventually,
Right.
and by that time, then it's ground down local centers of local resistance. Everyone's just an individual before this massive, oversized state. We're seeing all this play out. So this book might be from about 70 years ago, but it feels pretty relevant, I think, unfortunately.
Yes. If we're going to wrap up there, can I give like a very brief summary of what we did in case people jumped right in and aren't going to be able to go back? So we start at the beginning. Throughout the course of the stream, rather, we have made the case that liberalism is inherently incompatible with democracy. They are different. They cannot exist together, and democracy will inevitably destroy liberalism. Liberalism being the greatest allotment or the greatest attention of freedom and liberty afforded to a person that is, possible, that is feasible, rather. So that liberal system will inherently produce inequality. That is, liberalism will inherently result in different local cultures, different local languages, different orders. It will result in different families taking power, ultimately perhaps in a feudal system like you saw in the old order in Europe. It will result also in different abilities, people dividing their labor and acting accordingly. It will also result in the Christian idea of a vocation. That is, people are inherently different and they will have different divinely ordained things to do. So democracy is inherently against all of that. It makes things uniform. It homogenizes. It completely destroys a nation of all of its local identities and forces it into an artificial identity. And it does so in the most evil way possible. It will destroy childhoods. It will destroy the person, the very idea of the person itself and the personality. And it will force people into one uniform mass. It will force people to become mass men. And it will do this through the flagrant exercise of tyrannical power. I think that would summarize all the major points that I would have in case we had to catch people up that joined halfway through the stream. Would you have anything else, Radlib?
No, I just mentioned that in the chat I have put the I thought I did all three. Where's my other one? Where's me? Oh, there we go. Yeah. In the live chat, I've just put a pointer to the audiobook, thanks to Skeptical Waves, the ebook, and the physical book, which is only $13 at the Mises store. What a deal for such an amazing book. And we're going to continue with this. So he finishes his critique of democracy, and he says, we need to do a comparison now. So we've critiqued democracy, but we need to compare it to other forms. And so he says, I've decided to choose monarchy to compare to democracy because its historical record is the clearest and longest of all. That is, we have a long history of monarchy to look back at so that we can contrast monarchical systems of great variety, right? I mean, not everybody would say that all those kings and queens were good or bad. I mean, it was really diverse history. Yeah. And he says we can look back at this long history and do a meaningful comparison between this lengthy history of monarchy to what we've now concluded about democracy.
Right. And we talked about diversity earlier. That is true diversity, the differences in those localities and laws, measurements, languages, everything. It was very characteristic of the old order. The Austrian monarchy was not the same as the French monarchy, was not the same as the English monarchy, and you can do that with all of them. It creates a true diversity of system that is inherently tied to their culture, to their religion, to their localities. It is a very beautiful system, and I think that we'll get to that soon.
So I think next week we'll probably do current events on Econ Minis, but perhaps the week after, if we're both available, we will go on to the next topic that Kuehnelt-Leddihn touches on which is a chapter comparing democracy and monarchy. And I think, because we'll just do the one chapter from there, we might also draw in Hoppe, who also wrote about democracy versus monarchy.
Yes.
And I think Hoppe read Kuehnelt-Leddihn. He cites Kuehnelt-Leddihn, as I recall. So it's very influenced by him, but it'll be good to bring in both of their arguments, their perspectives on this. And it's I have to say, when I read Democracy, the God That Failed by Hoppe, where I first encountered some of these arguments, I found it a little bit shocking. I mean, I did, like everyone else, get propagandized. And so it was a bit of a shift to see these arguments for, arguments against the system that was supposedly goodness and wonderfulness, and arguments for a system that we had been taught was, no good, and you'd never want anything like that. It's something from the bad old past, right?
Right.
Okay, so let's hit some super chats. We have 2 on Subscribestar, which is where I encourage folks to support the show, because you can support it for as little as $5 a month. But that adds up to me being able to make some important purchases for the show. So lots of people giving a little bit each month really is, I think, the key way to support the show. So I would love to have your support, so we can keep doing this, keep making it better. Deus Light says, funds to help the stream. I'll have to catch up with the stream later. Keep up the good work. Antburger. Okay, and then Sam153 says, what is the highest proportion of informed citizenry possible? I get the feeling it's quite low. Yeah.
Well,
right.
The way they go about achieving that is to just destroy all standards. So I think you'll find it's actually quite high. It's just a euphemism for the lowest common denominator.
Okay, and then would you look up, Ryan, Acts 17:26?
Yes,
and
I
I'll come
will.
back to that once you get it. Hopefully, we'll.
Do you have any specific version that you like?
I know.
For biblical?
Whatever reads nice to you.
Okay.
I'll do some other super
remind me
chats
of
and
the.
come back to that.
It was Acts
17:26.
Okay.
Suicide is for optimists. Gives $5 with no comment. Thank you. Matthias says, make this topic into a series. We are, at least in this. We are, as we indicated, with monarchy. And then he forgot to send the text, but his comment was, he sent a second super chat, just commenting that Kierkegaard is a Dane. So go Danes. Yep. Absolutely, yes. Kierkegaard is my, historic Danish figure that means the most to me personally, I would say. Yeah. Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker says, yes, you can only be a good voter if you are educated to agree with the majority vote. That's a good way of looking at it. And Nanya Biz gives a very nice super chat saying, thanks for being smart and brave and good looking. That's so nice that they say that about you, Ryan.
I think it was about you. I think you'll find, Stephen.
Who knows? Who knows? They didn't specify, so let's just take it for both of us. Okay. Okay, so let me read you the super chat, and then you bring in what the text is. It said 17:26 to 26, so he might have meant to go on more than. Maybe you can figure it out.
Right. Yeah.
Jedi Knight Anakin Cringewalker says Acts 17:26 to 26, explicit that globo homo is a sin. So do you see what he's talking about there?
Yeah. So let me just read it. This is from the Book of Acts. Paul addresses the Areopagus. Sorry. Quote, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is not actually far from each one of us. So what we get there, that was the 26 and 27. You can go on, and it gets into the point that it's just an explanation of that last part. What we see here is Paul directly telling us that God made the nations and drew their boundaries and their dwelling places. So, very, it's kind of very explicit there in that not everything is homogenized and artificially just part of one great earth nation. So
right, and for those who fear the globo homo, I would just say that in the Book of Revelation, and in other places, I think, it talks about sort of the end of the world and there being followers of Christ from every nation and tribe and tongue. And what that tells me is that we're not all speaking Esperanto, and we're not all in a one world nightmare. At the end, the nations will still be nations. There'll still be separate languages, and from all of those peoples throughout the earth, there'll be people who followed Christ. So it's a vision of uniformity not winning in the end, even though, as we've seen, there's going to be attempts along the way that are going to be dreadful.
Right. And you can even see that. We know that God isn't going to institute something horribly unnatural and, very bad to us. People naturally are going to develop those different localities, those different systems, and we'll finally get to see them again in the end.
Right. Okay. I think we're all done. What a big show. That was, what? I've got a little timer here. So, 2.5 hours, something like that. But boy, it feels longer because we were doing some on-the-fly editing decisions that were painful. There's so much more we could do from that book.
If you want to catch up on the things that we did have to skip over, we, at least for the PDF that's available at the Mises Institute, we stopped at page 132. So if you want to go read those pages, or if you want to start at 133 and get ready for the next show that we do on this.
Yeah, it's not a long chapter.
The audiobook. Yeah. The audiobook is on Skeptical Wave's channel. He's a great writer. I would highly recommend to everyone that you go read this.
Fun read. Yeah, I will say Democracy and Monarchy, we just covered, as Ryan said, over 100 pages. But Democracy and Monarchy, this next chapter is about 30 pages in the physical book. So that's certainly something you could read by 2 weeks from now if you'd like to follow along a little more closely. Like I said, he's really rich, full of just amazing knowledge and stories and details. It's a joy to read. You feel like you're in the presence of a real gentleman. That's what it felt like when I met him right near the end of his life. Okay. Thank you to everybody. Okay, wait. I'm going to not mess up the close this time. Okay, I'm going to follow my instructions carefully. All right. Bye, everybody.